Dear brothers, what's up, boys? It's going to be a good day. It's going to be a good episode today. I got my dog sleeping next to me. They're out cold. We're going to talk about how we can get you guys a little more fit. Obviously, one of the main tenets, or I guess the main aim of this podcast, is to educate men on how to improve themselves both physically and mentally. As we approach episode 50, which is crazy, that comes out tomorrow, we have spent quite a lot of time on self-improvement through the mental side, really, talking about philosophy, honing in your thoughts, adjusting perspectives, being a better man to your family. But at the end of the day, as a lot of you know, I am by trade a performance coach and physical therapist. So the physical side of health is something that I have expertise in. And we're going to spend some more time on how to optimize your overall health so that not only are we gaining and becoming stronger mentally, but also physically. We want to be modern day Renaissance men that can actually bring back what it means to be a strong man. We cannot become soft of mind or body. And you can't protect your family in a weakened body. So, one of the most important factor, which must be addressed when it comes to health, is what we call VO2 Max. I'm not going to get all sciencey and physiological in this episode, so I want to keep this very simple and very straightforward. At this point, your VO2 Max is the best and greatest biomarker to predict success physically in life. What does that mean? It is one of our greatest predictions of health span, i.e. how well you live across time, lifespan, how long you live, and performance, be it in sport or just, playing with your children and letting them know who's king of the castle and holding them on the ground and having fun. It is also one of our greatest predictors of reducing all-cause mortality, i.e. all the things that try to kill you as you age. So for people that are in the 50th to 75th percentile, essentially, of VO2 max, they have a threefold, not one, not two, but a threefold decrease in all-cause mortality versus the bottom 20%, 25% really, of that curve. If you happen to be in the highest levels of VO2 max, where you're 75% or above based on your age group, that goes all the way up to fivefold, a fivefold decrease in the possibility of essentially all-cause mortality, be it from diabetes, heart disease, cancer, etc. In a nutshell, people who have a higher VO2 max are healthier, live longer, perform better, and reduce their chances of having a bunch of very shitty cardiovascular issues and other diseases. The evidence is absolute on this. Being unfit is likely the highest risk factor for all-cause mortality, aka all the stuff that kills you. So, what is this VO2 max? Simple. VO2 max is basically the maximum amount of oxygen that you can utilize during intense or maximal exercise. It's the max amount of oxygen that your body can take in, bring to the lungs. Lungs go to your blood goes to your muscles then utilize that for energy. Pretty simple. A metaphor that you'll see people use a lot is that VO2 max is kind of like your body's car engine. It's a loose metaphor, but it does a decent job. A larger engine can generally burn more fuel and produce more power. So a higher VO2 max allows the body to utilize more energy and have a larger aerobic capacity. Pretty simple. The more oxygen we can consume and utilize, the easier exercise feels on the body. Example. Someone whose VO2 max sucks is when they walk to the top of a set of stairs and they are winded. Versus the guy who can chase down the burglar, someone who stole something from them, telling them the whole time that they're going to whoop their ass. Doing said whooping of ass and then laughing the whole time like they didn't break a sweat. That's kind of where we want to get to. And I'm not going to use the word burglar anymore. That's really all you need to know about VO2 Max. We can get into the weeds pretty easily when you start talking about like your heart's stroke volume and how elite athletes have a bunch of other physiological markers we want to look at, and cardiac output and heart rate variability. You can get into a bunch of stuff. I really don't want you guys to worry about that. For the sake of the men that are listening to this podcast, VO2 Max is basically how well you can utilize oxygen and get it to your muscles so you can most effectively perform, live longer, and be sexier. Savvy? Excellent. So, how do we measure VO2 Max? The most accurate way to have this done is via what they call, wait for it, a VO2 Max test. I know, a brilliant name, really tells you everything you need to know. I'm going to name it something else because it needs to. But it's basically where you go into a lab, they hook you up to an EKG and basically this machine that's measuring oxygen going in and out, amongst other things. And they throw you on a treadmill or a cycle ergometer, and they continually increase the resistance and the intensity until basically your oxygen consumption plateaus. That's a very simple explanation, but that's essentially what you do. You go in, you do a erg or a treadmill, and you basically continue the intensity of the exercise until you just can't consume oxygen anymore. Pretty simple. Now, this is a test that I tell everyone they don't necessarily need to get immediately. Not everybody qualifies for this test right away. I usually like to have some kind of base level of fitness before I send somebody in to do a max effort heart rate and VO2 max test. I usually have my clients start with a couple of different varieties for a few months before we go down to, or we get up to something a little more intense. So how do we do that? If we're not going to do the hard intense test first, what are some other ways that we can find out our VO2 max? Well, the easiest way is, via something like an Apple Watch or a Whoop or a Fitbit. And although they're not dead accurate to what you're going to get in the lab, they are getting a far more accurate relative to what they used to be. They are going to give you kind of a generic base level number that you can utilize that tells us roughly what your VO2 max is. Now, it's not perfect, I understand that, and the one in the lab is obviously more accurate, but you guys can even go on the internet and there's equations where you can plug in your max heart rate and your resting heart rate, and it'll calculate your VO2 max for you. But basically, if you have an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or a Garmin or a Whoop that a lot of people wear, a lot of my clients wear, it's actually going to give you a number that's relatively decent, and it's at least a good starting point. However, something that you guys need to understand is that in order for that data to be somewhat useful, I kind of have to know what your higher heart rates are. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit. But the number one way to figure out what you got going on is you got to go to a lab, get hooked up, and do it. Almost every client that I have eventually does this in some capacity. And it is, again, such a high predictor of health that it's kind of a necessity. Speaking of predictor of health, we also need to talk about what the normative values are for your VO2 max. I'm going to go over this very quickly. You guys can look this up on the interwebs, but essentially it falls on a scale between very poor to excellent, and you'll see superior kind of listed other places. Maybe elite would be the top end. And VO2 max is measured in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. You don't have to know anything more than that. So essentially for men between the ages of 20 and 50, that's the numbers I'm going to kind of give you guys here. And these are obviously rough, but very poor to poor is really anything less than 28. If you are south of 20, Houston, we have some problems. We've got to make some changes. Below average to average for men between 20 and 50 is roughly about 30 to 40 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. Above average or excellent, which I want everybody getting into, is really anything north of 40, depending on where you fall in the age bracket. Elite folks are usually well north of 45, 55, even into the 60s, 70s, and beyond. These are typically your high-level endurance athletes, cyclists, rowers, Olympic athletes. And ages are roughly broken down into a decade. So it's like 18 to 23, 25 to 34, etc. But honestly, just go to Google, look up normative data for VO2 max, and you're going to have everything that you need to know. So even if you don't know your VO2 max, but you want to improve it, you know it's important. I just told you how important it was 56 times. How do you train to improve it? A quick aside, your genetics do play a decent role in how good your VO2 max can be. Your ability to optimize your oxygen intake is somewhat determined by how good mom and dad were at it. And if your mom and dad weren't very good at it, I hate to break this to you, but you're also not going to be great at it or as great at it as others. But contrary to what a lot of people will tell you, you can 100% improve your VO2 max regardless of whatever those genetics are. Again, it is our greatest predictor of longevity and avoidance of all the bad stuff that can happen to humans. And no matter if you have some good genetics for them or bad genetics for them, you can improve your VO2 max. So, how do we do that? Let's get to the fun stuff. Pretty simple. You need to be doing high intensity interval training, which all of you have probably heard 100 times. You hear people doing HIIT and the CrossFitters of the world and the F45s and this and that. All of you have heard of HIIT training before. It's not new, it's not novel, but for years we had this big kick of it needs to all be low intensity and steady state, and you should be in zone 2 and zone 3 cardio. And yes, that is important, but we're spending far less and not nearly enough time in zones 4 and 5 heart rates, which is essentially 80 to 100% of your max heart rate, which differs as you age, but even subjectively, even as people age, you know, there's going to be individual differences. But whatever your max heart rate is, zone 4 and 5 is north of 80% all the way to 100%. Like I said, a lot of people do tons of work in the lower heart rate zones, which is still a necessary function of health, but we have to be boosting your VO2 max. And to do that, we have to be doing high intensity interval training. How much of it? In my own training, I get at least 10 minutes of zone 5 heart rate per week, and that's what I get. But the best way for you to get into those heart rate ranges is as follows. You're going to pick a bike. I prefer the assault bike above pretty much anything else. Every client I have, if they have the ability, I tell them to get one or use the one at the gym. You can use a treadmill, you can use a rower, you can use a ski erg, or even something like burpees or even intervals with weights. I generally prefer things that don't necessarily involve weights because there's just less likely of a chance of you dropping something, getting hit by somebody, and getting injured, especially as you get tired. So with one of those implements, you're going to do a near maximal effort for a period of time, followed by enough rest to allow your heart rate to come down, and then you repeat it. I can't stress the following enough. It doesn't matter what implement you use to get your heart rate up. It just matters that you're getting your heart rate up to the point that you are uncomfortable and in that zone 4 and definitely zone 5 heart rate. When you finish with your last round of effort, with your last round of work, my recommendation is that you don't have to like bend over and hee and haw and heave, and you never really lose your former tempo throughout that effort. Although you're working very hard and you are exhausted and you are pushing harder and we're pushing boundaries, I don't want you feeling like you're about to keel over and you have to lay on the ground and die. That's probably a little bit too high of an effort, and it's really not necessary for us to make the changes that we need. So, what are the most tried and true ways to do that? My favorite, and the favorite that is recommended by pretty much every doctor that I work with and beyond, is the 4x4 method. That's my gold standard. But something that they don't ever mention is that that is something I want people to work up to. So the 4x4 method is simply this. You do 4 minutes of, that 80 to 100% max effort exercise, whatever you've chosen. And then you take 4 minutes off, and then you repeat it 4 times. So that sounds great, right? Actually, it sounds terrible. I don't know. It is terrible. But I'm not going to start someone who has little to no cardiovascular fitness exactly at that point. So what I do for people who are listening who might not have any real time spent in that cardio range, I have them basically start with this. We do 1 day a week of basically 30 minutes of low intensity steady state exercise of whatever their choice might be. And then we do 1 day of intervals. And those intervals are typically 30 seconds at a near max effort pace, followed by 1.5 to 2 minutes of recovery. I then repeat this the next week. And then week 3, we basically bump that to 45 seconds or a minute. Again, with 1.5 to 2 minutes of rest. We do that again week 4, week 5, we bump up to 1.5 minutes. And essentially we do this kind of every other week thing until we get to 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off. For people that have a little bit more cardiovascular fitness, or they're coming up from step 1, we usually go to 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, and repeat that 4 times. And then we eventually get to the top end, which is where we're talking about 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, and you repeat that 4 times. And that's for people that are in very good shape or they're used to doing this stuff. It's as easy as that. Could be a bike, could be a run uphill, could be all of those things, but that's what we're trying to do. Again, there is no need to try and go out and kill yourself if you haven't done any of this before. Consult with your doctor, make sure all your EKG stuff looks good, make sure that your blood work looks good, and make sure that you have some base level of fitness before you go crazy doing a bunch of VO2 max work. Also, you should still be focusing on doing lifting, eating well, sleeping appropriately. Although VO2 max is a great predictor of reducing all-cause mortality, you still have to be doing all of the other things. So how many days a week should you be doing this kind of high-level heart rate stuff, this HIIT work? Once. A lot of our studies have people doing this stuff once a week, and they are seeing good VO2 max changes across time. Obviously, you can bump to 2, but this is kind of a case-by-case basis. And with clients of mine, I usually don't go too crazy with doing that unless we have to, or if it's a part of their training regimen. Understand, guys, VO2 max is basically the closest thing we have to the Holy Grail from a biomarker perspective available. Obviously, you still need to eat well and sleep like I just talked about, but if you want to see yourself live longer and do better and enjoy life and be able to roll around with your grandkids and with your family and beat up on people at basketball and be able to beat the crap out of somebody that tries to break into your home, you want to improve your VO2 max. If you're struggling with this or you want some more information, drop me a message, leave a comment. I'm happy to help any way that I can. But do yourself a favor, go forth, be a badass, get your conditioning in, and please drop me a message when you do your first 4x4, because I imagine there's going to be a few 4-letter expletives that you're throwing at me. And I can't wait to see it. I love you guys. God bless. Be strong. Let's get after it, fellas.